I thought the man outside my truck was trying to hurt us when he locked my door in the middle of a snowstorm. I was wrong. He wasn't looking at me at all. He was staring at my grandson in the back seat, and the fear on his face told me something was terribly, horribly wrong. If I had opened that door, my grandson might not be alive today. Before I begin, if you've ever trusted your instincts and later realized they almost led you into danger, please leave a comment, and subscribe. Your support keeps stories like mine alive, and it helps others feel less alone. I've replayed that night so many times that it feels stitched into my bones now, like winter itself took up residence inside me. I'm a grandmother, the kind who keeps tissues in her coat pockets and hard candies in her purse, the kind who worries too much and prays quietly before long drives. That night, I believed I was doing something ordinary. I believed I was being careful. I believed that love and common sense were enough to keep a child safe. I was wrong about that, too. It was early December, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself loudly but seeps in through your gloves and settles behind your eyes. My daughter had called that morning, her voice tight with exhaustion, asking if I could pick up her son, my grandson Eli, from a school event in the next county. She was stuck at work, roads were already getting slick, and I hesitated just long enough to feel guilty. I told her yes, of course, because that's what grandmothers do. We say yes even when our stomach tightens. We say yes because love always answers before fear does. By the time Eli climbed into my old pickup, the snow had started falling thick and heavy, the kind that swallows sound and makes the world feel smaller. He was bundled up in his puffy blue coat, cheeks pink, eyes bright. He talked nonstop about a science project and a paper snowflake he'd made, his little voice filling the cab and pushing back my worry. I remember thinking that as long as he kept talking, everything felt normal. Children have a way of anchoring you like that. The road home cut through a long stretch of highway bordered by trees and open fields. Normally, it was peaceful. That night, it felt endless. The snow came down harder, the wind pushing it sideways so visibility shrank to just a few cart lengths ahead. I slowed down, knuckles white on the steering wheel, heater humming, windshield wipers struggling to keep up. My phone buzzed once with a weather alert before losing signal altogether. No bars, just silence and snow. Eli had gone quiet in the back seat, his head tipped slightly to one side. At first, I thought he'd fallen asleep. I glanced in the rearview mirror and smiled, that soft ache of love pressing into my chest. But something about the way he was sitting felt off, too still. His mouth was slightly open, breath shallow. I told myself he was just tired. Kids get like that after excitement. I told myself not to panic. A mile or two later, the truck shuddered, tires slipping as I eased over to the shoulder. I didn't want to stop, but I didn't want to risk the road either. Snow had piled up along the edges, and the world beyond my headlights was just white nothingness. I turned on my hazard lights and sat there, heart thudding, listening to the wind batter the truck like it wanted in. That's when I saw the glow of headlights behind me, bright and high, cutting through the snow. A snowplow. Relief washed over me so fast it almost made me dizzy. Help, I thought. Someone official, someone who knows these roads. I waved my hand slightly, hoping he'd see me. The plow pulled up alongside my truck, massive and loud, snow spraying as it idled. The driver leaned out his window, half hidden by a scarf and cap, eyes sharp and alert. He shouted something I couldn't hear over the wind. I cracked my window just enough for the cold to rush in and bite my cheeks. "Stay in the truck," he yelled in his voice. "Don't open the door." His tone wasn't kind, it wasn't gentle, it was commanding, urgent, the kind of voice that makes your heart jump. Before I could respond, before I could even ask why, he stepped down from the plow and moved fast, boots crunching through snow. Panic flared in me, a stranger in a storm telling me what to do. Every warning I'd ever heard screamed in my head. He reached my door before I could lock it myself. I heard the click, felt it through the handle as he locked it from the outside. My breath caught in my throat. I shouted, pounding on the window, fear roaring up so strong it tasted metallic. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "My grandson is in here." The man didn't look at me, not at first. His eyes were fixed on the back seat, on Eli. I followed his gaze, dread curling in my stomach. Eli hadn't moved. His eyes were open now, unfocused, his skin pale under the cabin light. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. "Don't open that door," the driver said again, his voice lower now, edged with something I couldn't place. Fear. "Ma'am, you need to stay put." I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight. Every instinct in me told me to get out, to grab my grandson, to do something. Instead, I froze, caught between terror and confusion, watching a stranger who seemed more afraid than I was. He backed away a step, raising his hands as if to calm me, but his eyes never left Eli. Snow plastered his coat, wind tugging at him, the storm howling like it wanted to swallow us whole. He said, "I saw something. When I pulled up, I saw something wasn't right." "What did you see?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face now. "That's my grandson." The driver swallowed hard. He glanced up and down the road, then back at me. "I need you to listen to me," he said. "I've been doing this job 20 years. I've seen hypothermia, I've seen medical emergencies, and I've seen what happens when people panic and make things worse." My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to keep them from flying apart. Eli let out a soft sound, not quite a cry, more like a breath catching. My heart fractured at the sound. "I thought you were trying to hurt us," I whispered to myself, more than to him. The driver met my eyes then, really looked at me, and for a moment I saw the weight he carried. "I'm trying to keep you alive, both of you." Snow continued to fall, thick and relentless, the world narrowing down to that moment, that locked door, that choice I didn't yet understand. I didn't know then that everything I believed about safety, about control, was about to be tested. I only knew that a stranger had taken charge of my fate, and my grandson's life hung in balance, waiting on a truth I wasn't ready to hear. The wind kept screaming around us, rattling the truck like it was trying to tear it open. And I remember thinking how small we were in that moment. Just a grandmother, a child, and a stranger standing between us and something unseen. The driver moved back toward his plow, shouting into a radio clipped to his jacket. I couldn't hear the words, only the urgency. He glanced back at Eli again, and that look, it settled something heavy in my chest. This wasn't suspicion or curiosity. This was alarm. I leaned into the back seat as far as my seatbelt would allow and called Eli's name. His eyes flicked toward me, but they didn't really focus. His lips trembled like he was cold, though the heater was blasting. "Grandma," he murmured, the words slurring together in a way that made my heart seize. I reached back, wanting to touch him, to pull him close, but I couldn't reach far enough. I told him everything was okay, because that's what we say when we don't know if it's true. The driver came back to my window, snow caked on his beard now. "Ma'am," he said, voice raised but steady, "how long has he been like that?" "Like what?" I snapped, anger flaring up to mask my fear. "He was fine. He was talking. He just got quiet." "That quiet isn't sleep," the driver said. "I saw his eyes when I pulled up. He's not tracking right." I didn't understand what that meant, but the words sank in like ice water. "What are you saying?" I asked. I think he's having some kind of medical episode, he said carefully, and I think opening that door right now could make it worse. That didn't make sense to me. Fresh air helps, doesn't it? That's what people say when someone's sick or faint. I told him so, my voice cracking. He shook his head. Not in this cold, not in this wind, and not if what I think is happening is happening. I felt useless, trapped behind glass, watching my grandson struggle in ways I couldn't reach. My mind raced through everything I knew about Eli. He was healthy, no allergies we knew of, no chronic conditions. He'd had a cold last week, a mild fever, nothing serious. I told the driver all of that in a rush, words tumbling over each other. He listened, nodding, eyes still flicking back to Eli. Sometimes, he said slowly, kids compensate. They seem fine until they're not. And sometimes cold stress triggers things you don't expect. Cold stress. The phrase sounded clinical and distant, nothing like the terror pounding in my chest. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice small now. "Please, tell me what to do." He took a breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "You keep him warm, you keep him still, and you don't open that door until help gets here." Help. The word felt both comforting and impossibly far away. I looked at my phone again, as if the signal might magically return. Nothing. The driver seemed to read my mind. "I've called it in. Ambulance is on the way. Might take a bit with this storm, but they're coming." I nodded, though the thought of waiting made my stomach churn. Every second felt stretched thin. Eli's breathing hitched, shallow and uneven. I twisted around in my seat as much as I could, reaching back to rub his arm through his coat. His skin felt hot now, too hot, a sharp contrast to the cold outside. "Grandma's here. I'm right here." The driver crouched slightly to peer in through the back window, careful not to startle Eli. "Hey, buddy," called Eli gently. "Can you squeeze your grandma's hand for me?" Eli didn't respond. His eyes fluttered, unfocused. I felt something inside me crack open, fear spilling out like water through a broken dam. I started to sob then, quiet at first, then harder, my body shaking. I almost stopped him from locking the door. I thought he was attacking us. I almost opened it. The driver's expression softened. "You did what any grandmother would do. You protected him the best way you knew. Now we just keep going." Snow piled up higher around the truck, the plow idling beside us like a guardian. The driver climbed back into his cab for a moment, then returned with a thick emergency blanket. He tapped on my window and held it up. "I'm going to crack the back window just enough to slide this in, not the door, just the window, okay?" I nodded quickly. Anything that might help. He did exactly as he said, swift and precise. The blanket shoved through the narrow opening before the cold could rush in. I wrapped it around Eli as best I could, my hands clumsy with fear. He made a small sound, a whimper, and I clung to that as proof he was still there. Minutes dragged by, or maybe it was longer. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the rise and fall of Eli's chest. The driver stayed close, checking the road, radio crackling with updates I couldn't hear. At one point, another plow passed slowly, the driver giving a quick nod of understanding. I realized then how alone we weren't, how this stranger was part of a quiet network of people who watched over roads and lives while the rest of us slept or panicked. Finally, faint sirens cut through the wind. Relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. Red and blue lights flashed through the snow, growing brighter as the ambulance approached. The driver stepped back, unlocking my door at last. "Now," he said firmly, "now you can open it." Paramedics moved quickly, calm and efficient, voices steady as they assessed Eli. They praised me for keeping him warm, for not moving him unnecessarily. One of them glanced at the driver and gave him a look of gratitude that said everything words didn't. As they loaded Eli into the ambulance, I climbed in beside him, holding his hand, whispering prayers I hadn't said out loud in years. Before the doors closed, I looked back at the snowplow driver. He stood there, snow swirling around him, face tired but resolute. "Thank you," I said, my voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I doubted you." He shook his head. "Fear makes us all strangers. You listened when it mattered." The ride to the hospital felt endless, but also strangely quiet. Eli's breathing steadied under the paramedics' care. They told me he'd had a sudden febrile seizure triggered by the cold and an underlying infection we didn't know about yet. Dangerous, yes, but manageable, treatable. Words I clung to like lifelines. Hours later, sitting beside his hospital bed, watching him sleep peacefully at last, the weight of what almost happened crashed over me. If I'd opened that door in panic, if I'd insisted on getting out, if that driver hadn't trusted his instincts enough to stop me, I couldn't finish the thought. When my daughter arrived, tears streaking her face, I held her and told her everything about the storm, the locked door, the stranger who saw what I couldn't. We cried together, gratitude and fear tangled up so tightly they were impossible to separate. Eli recovered fully. He doesn't remember that night, really. To him, it's just a story Grandma tells when the snow falls heavy. But I remember. I remember how close fear and safety stood to each other on that frozen road. I remember learning that sometimes protection looks like restraint, and sometimes trust comes from the most unexpected places. I still drive that highway, though I slow down more now. I still pray before winter trips. And every time I see a snowplow clearing the road, I feel a quiet swell of gratitude. Because one night, in the middle of a storm, a stranger locked my door, and in doing so, he unlocked a future where my grandson gets to grow up. The hospital room smelled like antiseptic and warm plastic, that strange mix that always makes time feel suspended. Machines hummed softly around Eli's bed, green lines pulsing steadily on the monitor, each rise and fall of his chest easing a knot inside me I hadn't realized was clenched so tight. I sat there all night, afraid that if I closed my eyes, something terrible would happen again. Every small sound made my heart jump. Every nurse who stepped in felt like both a relief and a reminder of how close we'd come to disaster. When the doctor finally came in, he spoke gently, the way people do when they know words carry weight. He explained the seizure in more detail, how the cold and the infection combined to overwhelm Eli's little body. He said most children recover fully, that this didn't mean a lifetime of illness or fear. I nodded along, absorbing only what I could, the rest blurring together. All I could think about was that moment on the road, the locked door, the choice I almost made. My daughter fell asleep in the chair beside me at some point, her head tipped back, exhaustion written into every line of her face. Watching her sleep, I felt the deep ache of generational fear, how worry passes down like an heirloom we never ask for. I wondered how many nights she'd lain awake when Eli was a baby, listening for his breath the way I was doing now. Love makes cowards of us all, I realized. It also makes us brave in ways we don't recognize until later. Morning light crept in through the narrow window, pale and tentative, as if unsure it was welcome after the night we'd had. Snow still fell outside, but softer now, quieter. A nurse came in with a smile and told us Eli was asking for juice. I laughed then, a shaky surprise sound that felt like life pushing back in. When he opened his eyes and looked at me properly, really looked, recognition clear and bright. I felt something inside me finally let go. "Grandma," he said, voice hoarse but steady, "did we get home?" I swallowed hard and smoothed his hair. "Not yet, sweetheart," I said, "but we will." Later that day, when Eli was resting again, a police officer came by to take a statement. Just routine, he said, since emergency services were involved on the highway. He asked me to describe what happened, and as I spoke, I realized how differently it sounded out loud, how dramatic, how unbelievable. A snowplow driver locking a grandmother inside her truck? I half expected skepticism, but the officer just nodded, jotting notes. "That driver did exactly what he was trained to do, probably saved your grandson's life." Saved his life. The words landed heavily, settling into me in a way that felt permanent. I thought of the driver's face, the way his eyes had gone straight to Eli, the certainty in his movements, training and instinct combined with compassion. I wondered how many other lives he touched without ever knowing their names. A few days later, after Eli was discharged, I drove home alone. The roads were clear now, snow pushed neatly aside, the storm a memory etched into white banks along the shoulder. As I passed the spot where we'd pulled over, my chest tightened. I pulled over again, just for a moment, hazard lights blinking in the quiet afternoon. The place looked ordinary, no sign of the fear that had once filled it. I sat there and breathed, letting the past and present overlap until they settled into something manageable. At home, life slowly returned to its rhythms. Eli went back to school. My daughter went back to work. Friends brought casseroles and asked gentle questions. Some people shook their heads and said how lucky we were. Others made jokes about overprotective grandmothers. I smiled and nodded, but inside I carried a deeper understanding of luck and choice. One evening, about a week later, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, there he was, the snowplow driver. He looked different without the storm around him, younger somehow, his face less lined without the strain of that night. He held his cap in his hands, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I hope this is okay," he said. I wanted to check on the boy." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Emotion rose up so fast it stole my breath. Then I stepped aside and ushered him in, tears spilling freely now. "Of course it's okay," I said. "Please, come in." Eli was on the floor in the living room, building something elaborate with blocks. When he looked up and saw the driver, he frowned, searching his memory. The driver crouched down, offering a small, tentative smile. "Hey, buddy, how you feeling?" Eli shrugged. "Good," he said, then brightened. "Grandma says you helped me." The driver nodded. "I guess I did." I made tea while they talked, my hands trembling slightly as I poured the water. When we sat down, I thanked him properly this time, words spilling out in a rush. He waved it off, uncomfortable with praise. "I just did my job," he said. "No," I said firmly. "You did more than that. You trusted your gut. You took responsibility. You stood in a storm and scared an old woman half to death because you knew it mattered." He smiled at that, a small, crooked thing. "You listened. That mattered too." We talked for a while about his work, about winter storms and long nights, about how often people underestimate danger because it doesn't look dramatic enough. Before he left, he hesitated at the door. "Most folks wouldn't want to see me again after something like that," he said quietly. "Thanks for opening the door." After he left, I sat in the quiet of my living room, thinking about doors and thresholds and the moments that change us. I thought about how close I'd come to making a choice driven purely by fear, how thin the line is between instinct and impulse. That night taught me something I carry with me now, something I try to pass on whenever I can. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay still. Sometimes help looks frightening at first, and sometimes the people who save us are the ones we almost push away. I tell this story not to scare you, but to remind you. Listen, pause. Trust doesn't always come wrapped in kindness, and love, real love, asks us to learn even when we're afraid. In the weeks that followed, I noticed how that night had changed me in quiet, unexpected ways. I became slower to react, but quicker to listen. When Eli stumbled or complained of a headache, I didn't panic the way I once might have. Instead, I watched. I asked questions. I paid attention to the small details I'd rushed past before, assuming love alone would catch everything important. It turns out, love needs patience to do its best work. Winter deepened its grip on our town. Snowstorms rolled in one after another, and every time the forecast warned of heavy snowfall, my chest tightened. I found myself checking the roads obsessively, calling my daughter to remind her to drive carefully, hovering at the window when Eli was outside playing. I worried I was becoming fearful instead of careful, that I might let that night shrink my world instead of expand my wisdom. One afternoon, while Eli was at school, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of cooling coffee and realized something uncomfortable. The fear I carried wasn't really about snowstorms or seizures or locked doors. It was about control, or rather, the lack of it. I had always believed that if I planned enough, worried enough, loved hard enough, I could prevent the worst from happening. That night on the highway had proven how fragile that belief was. I decided then that I wouldn't let fear turn me inward. I started volunteering at the community center again, something I'd stopped doing after my husband passed away years earlier. I signed up to help with the winter meal program, serving hot soup and bread to anyone who came through the doors. Many of them were snowplow drivers, road workers, people who spent their nights battling storms so the rest of us could sleep safely. I listened to their stories while we worked side by side, stories of whiteout conditions, of cars buried in drifts, of people who waved them down in desperation. I learned how often they arrived just in time and how often they arrived too late. Each story added another layer to my understanding of that night, of the weight the driver had carried when he locked my door. One evening, as I was wiping down tables, a familiar voice called my name. I turned to see him again, the snowplow driver, standing awkwardly by the doorway with a tray in his hands. We both laughed at the coincidence, the sound easing something between us. "You here to make sure no one opens the wrong door?" I teased gently. He smiled. "Something like that." We talked while he ate, about ordinary things this time, weather, work schedules, his family. I learned he had a daughter about Eli's age. That detail hit me harder than I expected. I imagined him standing in that storm, seeing my grandson through the window and thinking of his own child. The thought tightened my throat. As winter wore on, Eli asked questions. Children always do. One night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked, "Grandma, was I really that sick?" I hesitated, then answered honestly, but gently. I said, "You were sick enough that we needed help, and we got it." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You were scared." "Yes," I admitted. "I was very scared." "But you stayed," he said simply. His words settled into me like a blessing. Maybe that was the lesson he would carry, even if he forgot the details, that fear doesn't mean you leave, that staying can be its own kind of courage. Winter eventually crept in, melting the snowbanks, softening the sharp edges winter had carved into the landscape. Life felt lighter. Eli grew taller. My daughter laughed more easily. And yet that night remained with me, not as a wound, but as a scar, a reminder. I began telling the story at the community center during safety workshops, my voice steady but my hands always trembling just a little. I told it to parents and grandparents, to young drivers and seasoned ones. I watched their faces as they leaned in, curiosity turning to concern, then understanding. "I almost opened that door," I always said. "I almost let fear decide for me." People would nod, some swallowing hard, others wiping their eyes. Afterward, they'd come up to me, sharing their own close calls, their own moments of almost. It struck me how many of us walk around carrying stories like that, stories that could have ended differently if not for one choice, one stranger, one pause. One afternoon, long after the snow was gone, I drove past the highway again. This time, I didn't stop. I just slowed, glanced at the shoulder where we'd once sat trapped and terrified, and whispered a quiet thank you for the storm that taught me humility, for the stranger that taught me trust, for the grandson who taught me what really matters. Eli will grow up, and he will face his own storms. I won't always be there to lock a door or hold his hand, but I hope when the moment comes, he remembers this, that help sometimes arrives shouting instead of smiling, that safety sometimes feels like restraint, and that listening can be the bravest act of all. That night taught me something I never learned in all my years of loving and losing and living. We don't get to choose the storms that come for us, but we do get to choose how we respond. And sometimes choosing to stay in the truck, to trust the voice outside, is what carries us through. After spring settled in fully, life took on a rhythm that felt almost deceptively normal. The snowstorm became something people referenced casually, like a shared memory that had lost its teeth. But for me, it lingered in quieter ways. I noticed it when I checked the locks on my doors at night, not out of fear, but awareness. I noticed it when I paused before reacting, letting a breath come and go before I spoke. That night had taught me the difference between urgency and panic, and I was still learning how to live inside that space. Eli's doctor appointments continued for a while, follow-ups, blood work, reassurances. Each visit ended the same way, with smiles and gentle words about how resilient children are, and he was. He bounced back with a speed that left me both relieved and humbled. Children don't linger in fear the way adults do. They trust the world to keep moving, and somehow it often does. One afternoon, while Eli was at a friend's house, I sat with my daughter on the porch, the air warm and sweet with the smell of cut grass. She stirred her iced tea thoughtfully before speaking. "Mom," she said, "I keep thinking about that night." I nodded. "Me too." She swallowed. "I trusted you completely. I never doubted that you'd keep him safe. But now I realize how much you carried alone in that moment." Her words pressed into me, heavy and tender all at once. "I almost failed him," I said quietly. She shook her head. "No, you almost learned something. There's a difference." We sat in silence after that, the kind that feels full instead of empty. I realized then that my fear of that night wasn't just about Eli. It was about my own aging, my quiet worry that maybe I wasn't as capable as I once was, that maybe the world was moving faster than I could keep up with. But that stranger in the storm hadn't seen an old woman fumbling in the cold. He'd seen a grandmother who stayed, who listened, who did what she could with what she had. A few weeks later, the town held a small appreciation event for emergency workers and road crews. I went, unsure why I felt compelled to, but knowing I needed to. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter, people holding paper plates and paper cups, a sense of shared pride hanging in the air. When the snowplow driver spotted me, he raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You keep showing up in unexpected places," he said with a grin. "So do you," I replied. During the brief ceremony, names were called, hands shaken, applause given. When his name was read, something swelled in my chest. He looked embarrassed as he stepped forward, shrugging like it was no big deal. But I clapped harder than anyone, tears pricking my eyes again. Gratitude doesn't fade when it's real, it deepens. Afterward, he came over, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me. "On the house," he said. We talked for a while about nothing important and everything important all at once. At one point, he grew quiet, staring into his cup. "You know," he said, "I've thought about that night too." I waited. "I've locked doors before, yelled at people, been ignored. Sometimes they get mad, sometimes they don't listen at all. This time, I was scared you wouldn't." "I was scared I would," I admitted. He nodded. "Fear makes quick decisions." "Yes," I said, "and wisdom asks us to slow down." That summer, Eli learned to ride his bike without training wheels. I jogged behind him, heart pounding, hands hovering uselessly in the air as he wobbled and laughed. When he finally steadied himself and rode off on his own, he turned back to me, eyes shining. "Did you see me, Grandma?" he called. "I did," I said, voice thick. "I always do." Watching him ride away, I understood something else that night had given me. It reminded me that my job wasn't to prevent every fall, it was to recognize when to hold on and when to let go, when to act and when to trust. As the seasons turned again and winter crept back into the forecast, I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. But this time, it didn't paralyze me, it reminded me. I stocked my truck with extra blankets, I checked weather reports more carefully, I taught Eli what to do if he ever felt strange or scared. Knowledge, I learned, is fear's quieter cousin. It doesn't shout, it steadies. One night, as snow began to fall lightly, Eli sat beside me on the couch, watching it drift past the window. "Grandma," he said, "if something scary happens again, will you know what to do?" I looked at him, really looked at him, so alive and curious and trusting. "I'll know to listen," I said, "and I'll know to ask for help." He seemed satisfied with that. Children understand more than we think. That story, the one I've been telling you, isn't really about a storm or a locked door or even a snowplow driver, though he will always be part of it. It's about the moment when instinct meets humility, when love learns it doesn't have to be loud to be strong. It's about realizing that survival isn't always about fighting. Sometimes it's about waiting, about letting someone else take the lead, even when every nerve in your body is screaming to run. I carry that lesson with me now, like a compass I didn't know I needed. It points me towards patience, towards listening, towards trust that's earned not by comfort, but by clarity. And every time winter returns, every time I hear the low rumble of a snowplow in the distance, I pause, I breathe, and I remember that night when staying put saved a life and fear learned to step aside. By the time the next winter arrived, I felt different. Not braver exactly, but steadier. Like something inside me had found its footing. The first heavy snowfall of the season came late one evening, thick flakes tumbling down in the glow of streetlights. Eli pressed his face to the window, excitement bubbling over, while I watched with a quieter kind of awareness. Snow was beautiful again, but it was no longer innocent. That night the phone rang just after dinner. It was my neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, her voice shaky as she explained her car had slid into a shallow ditch a mile down the road. She wasn't hurt, but she was scared. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat. Halfway to the door, I stopped. That pause, that single breath, felt like a small victory. I called road assistance instead, stayed on the line with her, talked her through keeping warm until help arrived. When I hung up, my hands were trembling, but my heart was calm. I knew why I'd stayed home. I knew I'd made the right choice. Eli watched me quietly from the couch. "You helped her," he said. "Yes," I replied, "but I didn't have to go to her to do it." That seemed to settle in him. It settled in me, too. Not long after that, the community center asked if I'd be willing to speak during a winter preparedness night. I almost said no. Public speaking had never been my strength. But something in me knew that story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged wherever it could make someone stop and think. The room was full of familiar faces and strangers alike. Young parents with babies bundled tight, elderly couples holding hands, teenagers pretending not to listen but leaning in anyway. I stood at the front, heart racing, and told them about the storm, the locked door, the fear that nearly overruled reason. I told them about the snowplow driver who didn't hesitate, who chose to be firm instead of friendly, because that's what the moment required. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long beat. Then questions came, practical ones, emotional ones. A young mother asked how she'd known to trust him. An older man asked what signs he'd seen in Eli. A teenage girl asked what to do if an adult ever scared her while trying to help. I answered as honestly as I could. I didn't know, I said. I was terrified. Trust isn't about certainty. It's about choosing to listen long enough to understand. Afterward, people lingered. A man pulled me aside and told me about the night he'd ignored a road worker's warning and nearly paid for it. A woman hugged me and whispered that my story reminded her to slow down. Each interaction felt like a small thread, weaving my experience into a larger fabric of shared understanding. At home, Eli asked me again to tell him the story, the full one this time. I hesitated, wondering how much was too much for a child, but he listened intently, eyes wide, asking thoughtful questions. When he finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That man was brave," he said. "Yes," I agreed, "he was." "And you were too," Eli added. I smiled, but inside I felt something shift. I'd spent so long focusing on what I almost did wrong that I'd forgotten to see what I'd done right. I stayed, I listened, I didn't let fear make the final decision. That mattered. As the winter deepened, snowstorms came and went without incident. Each one felt like a test I passed simply by respecting it. I stocked supplies, I planned carefully, and when roads closed, I accepted it without frustration. Control, I learned, isn't about forcing your way through. It's about knowing when not to. One evening, as I was driving home from the grocery store, I spotted a snowplow pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking. A car sat angled awkwardly nearby. Without thinking, my chest tightened. Then I slowed, pulled safely to the side at a distance, and waited. I didn't rush in. I didn't assume. I watched as the driver spoke calmly to the motorist, gesturing toward the car, then the road. Everything was under control. As I drove away, I felt a strange swell of pride, not because I'd been involved, but because I understood what I was seeing. The quiet professionalism, the unseen vigilance, the choices made before disaster ever had a chance to arrive. That night, I wrote a letter. I wasn't sure where it would end up, but I addressed it to the department responsible for road safety. I wrote about the driver who locked my door, about the fear and the trust and the outcome that followed. I thanked them for training people to be decisive even when it makes them unpopular. A few weeks later, I received a reply. Simple, grateful. They said my words would be shared. Life moved on as it always does. Birthdays came and went, holidays filled the house with noise and warmth, but the lesson of that night stayed close, surfacing whenever I felt rushed or overwhelmed. It reminded me that urgency doesn't always mean action. Sometimes it means stillness. Sometimes it means letting someone else steer. One afternoon, Eli came home from school quieter than usual. When I asked what was wrong, he shrugged, eyes downcast. "A kid in my class got hurt," he said. "People panicked." I sat with him, listening as he explained. "Did anyone help?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "A teacher told everyone to stop and listen, and it worked." I reached out and squeezed his hand. The circle closed gently in that moment. The lesson passed on, not through fear, but through understanding. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked me, "Grandma, are you still scared of snowstorms?" I thought about it honestly. I respect them, I said, but I'm not afraid the same way anymore. He nodded, satisfied. As I turned off the light, I realized something else had changed. I no longer replayed that night with regret. I replayed it with gratitude. Gratitude for the pause, gratitude for the stranger, gratitude for the chance to learn before it was too late. Some stories end with a single dramatic moment. Mine didn't. It kept unfolding, quietly shaping how I moved through the world. And maybe that's the truest kind of ending there is. As years quietly layered themselves over that winter, the story settled into me like a second heartbeat. Not always loud, not always present, but steady. Eli grew older, his legs longer, his questions deeper. And every time the snow came, he'd glance at me with a knowing look, like we shared a secret the rest of the world didn't fully understand. One afternoon, when Eli was about 10, he came home from school upset. He dropped his backpack by the door and sat heavily at the kitchen table, shoulders slumped. "What happened?" I asked, setting a mug of cocoa in front of him. He said, "A substitute teacher," he said. "She yelled at us. Everyone got mad." I waited, letting silence do its work. He continued, "She told us to stay in our seats during a drill. Some kids wanted to leave. They said she was being bossy." I felt a quiet spark of recognition. "And what did you think?" I asked. He wrapped his hands around the mug, steam fogging his glasses. He thought, maybe she was scared, or maybe she knew something we didn't. My throat tightened. "What did you do?" He said, "I stayed," he said simply. Later that night, I sat alone, thinking about how easily moments echo forward, how one night on a frozen highway could ripple into a classroom years later. That realization humbled me more than anything else had. We never really know which of our choices will teach the biggest lessons. My daughter noticed the change in Eli, too. He'd become thoughtful, cautious in a way that wasn't fearful, curious without being reckless. She told me once that she felt calmer knowing he had that balance. I didn't tell her how much of that balance came from a stranger in a snowstorm, from a door that stayed closed. Around that same time, the snowplow driver retired. I heard about it through the community center, his name mentioned during a meeting as they discussed staffing changes. The news surprised me with a sharp pang of emotion. Retirement felt like an ending I hadn't prepared for. I realized how much comfort I'd taken in knowing he was out there somewhere, watching the roads. I wrote him a letter then, longer than the first. I told him about Eli growing up, about the ways that night still shaped us. I told him that his decision hadn't just saved a life, it had built one. Weeks passed before I heard back. When his reply came, the envelope was thick, his handwriting careful. He wrote about his own children, about how he'd always worried whether he'd done enough, whether the long nights and hard choices had mattered. He said my letter reminded him why he'd stayed in that job for so long. At the end, he wrote, "Sometimes we never see the full reach of what we do. Thank you for showing me." I folded that letter and tucked it into a drawer with other precious things. It felt like closing a circle. Life continued in its ordinary, extraordinary way. School projects, family dinners, quiet evenings on the porch. And yet, every winter, when the first plow passed by with its deep, steady rumble, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not fear, awareness. One winter evening, much later, I found myself driving again during a storm. Not by necessity, but by choice. I checked the forecast carefully. The roads were treated, the snow was light. Still, as flakes began to fall thicker, my hands tightened on the wheel. I pulled into a rest area and sat there for a moment, listening to the soft hiss of snow against the windshield. I thought about that night long ago, about how much I'd changed since then. I didn't feel trapped this time. I felt prepared. A snowplow rolled past, its lights cutting through the dusk. I watched it go, a quiet smile touching my lips. Some fears don't disappear. They mature. They become something that guides instead of governs. At home, Eli was waiting, taller now, his voice deeper. "You okay?" he asked when I walked in. "Yes," I said. "I just needed a moment." He nodded, understanding without explanation. That night, after he'd gone to bed, I stood by the window watching snow swirl under the streetlight. I thought about all the doors we encounter in life, the ones we're tempted to fling open in panic, the ones we're told to keep closed even when it feels wrong. And I thought about how wisdom often arrives wrapped in discomfort. If there's one thing I hope you take from my story, it's this. Fear is loud, but it isn't always right. Trust is quieter, but it listens. The space between them is where our truest choices are made. That night on the highway didn't just teach me how to survive a storm. It taught me how to live with uncertainty, how to pause instead of react, how to let others help even when their help feels frightening at first. I used to think strength meant action. Now I know it often means restraint. It means listening when every instinct tells you to move. It means believing that not all protection feels gentle in the moment. And when I look at my grandson now, standing on the edge of his own growing independence, I feel a deep, quiet hope. Not that he'll never face danger, but that when he does, he'll remember to pause, to listen, to trust wisely. Because sometimes staying put is what carries you safely through the storm. Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest memories, but it never quite erases them. Instead, it turns them into guideposts. By the time Eli reached his teenage years, that winter night had become part of our family's quiet mythology, not something we spoke about constantly, but something that hovered in the background, shaping the way we approached risk and responsibility. Teenagers test boundaries. That's part of growing up. When Eli started wanting to go out with friends on his own, to ride in cars driven by kids barely older than himself, I felt that old knot of fear tighten again. But I didn't let it rule me. Instead, we talked about weather, about judgment, about listening to the people whose job it is to keep you safe, even when they sound strict or inconvenient. One night, after a basketball game ran late, Eli called me. Snow had started falling unexpectedly, and the roads were getting slick. "Grandma," he said, trying to sound calm, "Coach says we should wait it out." I felt pride swell in my chest. "That sounds like a good plan," I said. "I'll stay up. Call me if anything changes." When he came home hours later, safe and tired, he hugged me without a word. In that embrace, I felt the echo of that long-ago night, fear transformed into trust, panic replaced by patience. As I grew older, my own body reminded me of its limits. My knees ached in the cold, my reflexes slowed just enough to notice. I adjusted, as we all must, finding new ways to be careful without being afraid. I stopped driving at night during storms unless absolutely necessary. I planned trips earlier in the day. These weren't losses, they were adaptations. The community center invited me back again, this time to speak to a group of new road safety trainees, younger faces, eager and a little nervous. I told them my story from the other side now, as someone who had once been on the receiving end of their authority. "You might be yelled at," I said. "You might be doubted. You might scare people. But if your training and your instincts tell you to act, act. The gratitude might come much later, or not at all, but it matters." Afterward, one young man approached me, eyes serious. "Did you ever resent him for locking you in?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. "For a moment," I said, "but resentment fades when understanding takes its place." At home, Eli overheard me practicing that talk once. "You really trust them," he said. "I trust people who know what they're doing, and I trust myself to listen." That trust extended beyond winter roads. When doctors spoke, I listened more carefully. When teachers raised concerns, I paused before reacting defensively. When strangers offered help, I evaluated instead of rejecting. The lesson of that night reached far beyond snow and storms. Years later, when Eli was preparing to leave for college, we sat together on the porch, the air crisp with early autumn. He was excited, nervous, full of plans and possibilities. I watched him, seeing both the boy he'd been and the man he was becoming. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd opened the door?" I took a slow breath. "I try not to live there," I said, "but I remember it enough to be grateful." He nodded. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted. "It makes me careful, not scared, just aware." That was all I could have hoped for. The first winter after Eli left home was harder than I expected. The house felt quieter, storms felt louder. Without him there, my role shifted again. I found myself thinking back to the younger version of me, sitting in that truck, heart racing, trying to decide who to trust. I felt compassion for her now rather than judgment. She'd done the best she could with what she knew. One snowy evening, the power went out briefly. I lit candles, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat listening to the wind. Instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of peace. I knew how to wait. I knew how to endure. When the lights came back on, I smiled, thinking of all the nights I'd survived without realizing how strong patience could be. I share this story now not because it's traumatic, though it was, but because it's human, because we all face moments when fear demands action and wisdom asks for stillness, because sometimes the voice telling us to stop, to wait, to stay put is the very thing that keeps us safe. And because somewhere out there, maybe right now, someone is sitting in a car during a storm, heart pounding, unsure what to do. If my story reaches them, if it gives them permission to pause, then every retelling is worth it. That night, long ago, a stranger locked my door. In doing so, he opened a path I still walk today, a path of trust, restraint, and quiet courage. As the years continued to unfold, I began to notice how often people confuse confidence with certainty. They aren't the same thing. Certainty is rigid. Confidence leaves room to adjust. That night on the highway taught me that the hard way, and the lesson kept resurfacing in places I never expected. When Eli was away at college, he called me one evening during his first winter semester. Snow had fallen unexpectedly, and campus roads were slick. His voice carried that familiar mix of independence and uncertainty. "Grandma," he said, "they're telling us to stay in the dorms, but some people want to go out anyway." I closed my eyes for a moment, the memory of flashing hazard lights and swirling snow rising up uninvited. "What do you think?" I asked gently. "I think," he said after a pause, "that I'm staying put." I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. That sounds wise. After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, letting the quiet settle around me. That was when it truly hit me. The night I thought was about survival had really been about inheritance, not money or property, but judgment, discernment, the ability to pause when everything inside you is screaming to move. I started journaling more after that, not just about the storm, but about all the moments in my life when I'd reacted too quickly, when fear or pride had driven the wheel. Writing gave me distance. It helped me see patterns. How often my worst decisions came from urgency without information. How often my best ones came from listening. One entry stood out. I wrote about how trapped I'd felt when the driver locked my door, how humiliating it had been to feel powerless. And then I wrote about how that powerlessness had actually protected me. That realization changed how I viewed so many things: aging, asking for help, letting others lead. We're taught to value independence so fiercely that we forget interdependence is what actually keeps us alive. That truth became clearer when my own health faltered briefly. Nothing dramatic, just a scare that landed me in the hospital for a couple of nights. Lying there, listening to machines hum, I felt echoes of that old fear rise up again, the instinct to control, to push through, to get up and leave before I was ready. But this time, I didn't fight the process. I listened to the nurses. I waited for test results. I stayed put when my body asked me to, and I healed faster than I expected. When I came home, I realized something else had shifted. I trusted systems more than I used to, not blindly, but thoughtfully. I understood now that expertise doesn't always come wrapped in kindness, and care doesn't always feel comforting in the moment. One winter, years later, a major storm hit our region, worse than the one Eli and I had faced. Roads closed, power outages spread late into the night. I watched the news as reporters stood knee-deep in snow, urging people to stay home. My phone rang constantly, friends checking in, neighbors asking advice. I repeated the same words over and over: stay put, keep warm, don't rush. At one point, I caught myself smiling sadly. I'd become the calm voice I once needed. When the storm finally passed, stories emerged, some tragic, some miraculous. A man rescued after being stranded for hours, a family saved because they'd stayed in their car instead of trying to walk for help. Each story felt like a confirmation, a quiet nod from the universe. Eli came home that summer, taller again, more sure of himself. We took a drive together one afternoon, just the two of us. When we reached that stretch of highway, he glanced out the window. "This is where it happened, right?" he asked. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't remember much, but I remember your voice telling me to stay calm." Tears blurred my vision, and I slowed the car slightly. "That's because I was talking to myself, too," I said softly. We didn't stop. We didn't need to. The place no longer held fear for me. It held meaning. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, Eli said something that surprised me. "I think people underestimate how hard it is to do nothing." They do, I agreed. Doing nothing feels like failure, but sometimes it's the most responsible thing you can do. He nodded thoughtfully. "I think that's what you taught me." I looked at him then, really looked at him, and felt a deep, steady peace. Not relief, not pride, peace. As I grow older, I know my world will continue to shrink in some ways. Fewer long drives, fewer late nights. But the inner landscape has expanded. I carry a clarity now that wasn't there before, a trust in pause, a respect for restraint. If I could speak to the woman I was that night, pounding on the window in fear, I wouldn't scold her. I'd take her hand and say, "You're about to learn something that will shape the rest of your life. Be patient, listen." And if you're listening now, carrying your own storm inside you, unsure whether to move or stay, hear this: urgency lies, fear rushes, wisdom waits. Sometimes survival doesn't look like escape. Sometimes it looks like staying exactly where you are until help arrives. That night, I stayed in the truck, and in doing so, I learned how to stay present for the rest of my life. The following winter, the snow came earlier than anyone expected. Thick, wet flakes that clung to power lines, bent tree branches, and blanketed the town in that disorienting hush that comes only when the world is drowning in white. I watched from my living room window, cup of tea warming my hands, feeling the familiar tightness of anticipation. Not fear, exactly, not anymore, but respect, awareness. That storm felt like a reminder, a quiet test of everything I had learned over the years. Eli was home for the holidays. He'd been driving himself, now of age, carrying a confidence that had been nurtured by every small choice he'd made since that night on the highway. He came in laughing, cheeks flushed from the cold, and I couldn't help but notice how much taller he'd grown, how his shoulders had broadened, how that sense of responsibility seemed to settle over him like a mantle. I remembered the boy in the back seat, eyes glassy with confusion, and I marveled at how time had transformed both of us. "Grandma," he said, shaking snow from his coat, "you're staring like I'm a stranger." "You're not," I replied softly, smiling. "I'm just remembering." He followed my gaze to the window, the road hidden beneath a thick white quilt. "Remembering what?" he asked. "That night, the storm, the truck, the door." He nodded, eyes thoughtful. "I was scared too, I just didn't know it at the time." We spent that evening talking about it, about how fear shapes memory, about how small decisions can have outsized consequences. He asked questions, ones I hadn't considered in years, why the driver had been so certain, how he'd known not to panic, and why I had trusted him despite thinking he was a threat at first. I answered honestly. He had experience and instinct, and so did I eventually. Fear teaches you one thing, but experience teaches another. That night, I learned to listen before I acted. Eli nodded slowly. "I hope I'll remember that if I'm ever in a situation like that." "You will," I said, "because you already have." Later that evening, as he slept, I sat on the porch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Snowflakes drifted onto my hair, onto the ground, and the world was quiet in a way that demanded stillness. I thought about the first time I had felt trapped in the truck, the panic pressing against my chest, my fingers trembling on the steering wheel. Back then, every instinct screamed to fight, to escape, to act. And now, decades later, I understood something I hadn't back then. Survival isn't always about action. Sometimes it's about waiting. I thought about the snowplow driver, now retired, living quietly somewhere, unaware of how deeply he had shaped our lives. I thought about the network of people who make difficult decisions in storms, emergencies, and crises, often without recognition. How many lives are saved in silence because someone knows when to act and when to pause? That winter, the storm raged through the night. Power flickered, roads iced over, trees groaned under the weight of snow. I did not panic. I checked on the neighbors who needed help. I made sure Eli's room was warm. I kept extra blankets and water at the ready. And when the hours stretched long, I sat by the window, listening to the wind, feeling the steady rhythm of my heartbeat as if it were a metronome counting out patience. At some point, I thought about the thousands of little decisions we make every day, the times we choose to step forward, the times we choose to hold back, the times we listen when everyone else is shouting. I realized that night in the truck was less about fear and more about discernment, less about danger and more about presence. It taught me that life is made up of these small, critical choices, and that sometimes the bravest act is to trust someone else's judgment when your own instincts are screaming. Weeks after the storm passed, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the snowplow driver. His handwriting was steady, deliberate. Inside, he wrote about the storms he had faced, the people he had helped, and the nights he had spent worrying whether he did enough. He thanked me for remembering him, for acknowledging the weight of a single choice, for understanding that courage isn't always visible. His words were simple but powerful. That night, you stayed, you listened. That made all the difference, and so did he. I kept the letter in my journal, alongside the ones Eli had written over the years, alongside my own reflections, each one a testament to the subtle threads that connect people across time and circumstance. Eli left for college again after winter break. That night, as I tucked him in one last time before his early morning departure, he said, "Grandma, I think I understand now, not just about that night, but life." I smiled, feeling both pride and a quiet ache. "And what do you understand?" I asked. "That fear isn't the enemy," he said. "It's just a guide, but it can't make the decisions for you." "Exactly," I said, pressing a kiss to his forehead. When he drove away the next morning, the snow still glistening under the streetlights, I felt the old knot of anxiety rise, but only briefly. I trusted him. I trusted the lessons we'd both learned, and most of all, I trusted that he would remember to pause, to listen, and to act with care when it mattered most. That spring, I began volunteering at a local senior center, sharing stories of resilience, of caution, of courage. I noticed how people leaned in, how young adults listened with rapt attention, how older folks nodded knowingly, as if they had carried their own storms. Each retelling reminded me of the universal truth I had learned on that highway, that life is unpredictable, that danger comes when you least expect it, and that choices define outcomes far more than circumstances ever could. One evening, a young mother came up to me, tears streaking her cheeks. She whispered, "I think your story just saved my son's life. He wanted to run outside during a storm. I was panicking, but I remembered what you said about waiting and listening." I nodded, barely able to speak. Some lessons, I realized, extend far beyond a single family, far beyond a single night. They ripple outward through every interaction, every cautionary tale, every shared piece of wisdom. That summer, Eli returned for a visit. He'd grown into a young man whose confidence was tempered by humility. One afternoon, we went for a drive, winding through the same highways I had once seared. He pointed to the shoulder where we had stopped that night, snow caked on the ground. "I can't believe I didn't remember much of that night," he said, "but I think I'll carry the lesson forever." "You already have," I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. That night, we sat on the porch together, listening to the crickets and the hum of the night air. I thought about all the doors we encounter in life, doors of choice, doors of fear, doors of trust. I thought about the night the truck door was locked and how that simple act had carried us both forward, teaching patience, discernment, and humility. Life is full of storms, I realized. Some are literal, some are emotional, some are silent, creeping in slowly. But preparation, calm, and the willingness to listen can carry us through. And sometimes someone else's decision, made with care and insight, is the difference between life and regret. That night, as snowflakes began to dust the yard, I finally understood fully that the story isn't just about a storm. It's about trust. It's about courage tempered with patience. It's about listening to voices that might initially frighten us, because sometimes they're the only ones guiding us to safety. And most importantly, it's about recognizing that our choices ripple farther than we realize, that staying in the truck, trusting the stranger outside, and listening when fear tells you to act impulsively, it all mattered, more than I could have known at the time. The years moved on, gentle but relentless, and that night in the truck never left me. It wasn't a memory I revisited constantly, but when I did, it carried weight. Not of fear, not of regret, but of understanding. It had become a compass, guiding me through the ordinary storms of life. A sick child, a missed bus, a cold winter morning when my body protested the smallest effort. It reminded me that courage isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, invisible, and patient. Eli had grown into a man I barely recognized in height, yet fully in spirit. His laughter still carried the same warmth, his curiosity the same spark. And yet, when we spoke about that night, rarely, but often enough to matter, I saw a maturity in his eyes that surprised me. One evening, while we sat by the fire, he asked quietly, "Grandma, did you ever regret staying in the truck?" I looked at him, really looked, as I had countless times over the years, and shook my head. "No," I said. "I nearly panicked. I nearly made the wrong choice. But when I paused, when I listened, we were safe, and I learned something I still carry." He nodded as if he understood without needing more explanation, but I knew he wanted the full truth. "I learned," I continued, "that fear isn't the enemy. It's a guide, yes, but not the boss. Instinct tells you to act, to run, to fight. Wisdom teaches you to pause, to listen, to assess. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is nothing at all." He smiled, that familiar mix of youthful hope and growing insight. "I think I understand now," he said, "and I hope I'll remember it when I'm on my own, when I have to make a choice that matters." That night, I realized the story had passed from me to him, not just the narrative, but the lesson, the invisible map that marked safety and patience. And I felt a surge of gratitude, not only for the stranger who locked my door, but for the storm itself, for the fear, and for the clarity that followed. Time continued its quiet work. My hair silvered, my hands bore the faint lines of years and worry, but I moved with the steadiness that comes from experience. Each winter, I checked the forecast, stocked blankets, called neighbors if needed, but I no longer carried panic with me. Snow became something to respect, not to fear. My heart, once tight with anxiety, had learned how to breathe through storms. One afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. The snowplow driver, older now, retired fully from his job, stood at my door. His eyes held the same sharp focus I remembered, tempered now with the softness that comes from years of reflection. "He wanted to see him," he said, nodding toward Eli, who had come to greet him. "The boy you saved and the man he's becoming." Eli shook his hand, a little awkward, a little proud. "Thank you for that night," he said, his voice steady, "for helping me without knowing me." The driver smiled, a small, almost shy expression. "I didn't do much," he said. "I just acted. You stayed, you listened. That mattered more than anything I could do." I watched them talk, felt a deep sense of closure. The circle had come full. Fear, trust, courage, guidance, all woven together in one night, one choice, one locked door. And yet, life didn't stop there. That night had given me more than a story. It had given me a lens through which to see the world, a way to measure risk and compassion, wisdom and patience. Weeks later, I found myself alone on the same stretch of highway where it all began. Snow fell softly, a gentle curtain over the asphalt. I stopped, hazard lights blinking, and watched the road. It looked ordinary, safe, but I knew better. I knew what the storm could do, how quickly things could change. I also knew what patience and listening could do. I pressed my hand to the steering wheel, feeling the echo of that night. I remembered the panic, the shaking, the fear for Eli's life. I remembered the decision to stay, the stranger's voice outside, and the clarity that followed, and I felt a quiet, powerful gratitude. Life, I realized, is made up of these moments, choices, pauses, actions that seem small at the time but echo far beyond what we can see. The lessons of that night had shaped me, my daughter, my grandson. They had shaped how I faced illness, aging, storms, and everyday uncertainty. They had shaped how I listened, how I acted, how I trusted. That evening, as I drove home, I passed the familiar roads, the quiet neighborhoods, the empty fields dusted with snow. I thought about all the people I would never meet who face storms alone, who hear voices that frighten them but carry the wisdom they need to survive. I thought about every choice I had made since that night and every one that still lay ahead. When I pulled into the driveway, Eli was waiting. He smiled, snowflakes caught in his hair. "Grandma," he said, "do you think we're ever really done learning?" I laughed softly. "No, sweetheart. Life is teaching us every day, but that's the beauty of it. We learn, we pause, we act, and sometimes we survive. Sometimes we thrive." He nodded, quiet for a long moment, then hugged me. I held him tight, feeling both the boy he once was and the man he would become. And in that embrace, I understood fully, survival isn't just about avoiding danger. It's about learning how to live with fear, how to listen to it, and how to choose wisely when it speaks. That night, I tucked Eli in, the way I had done so many times before. I kissed his forehead, whispered a blessing over him, and watched him sleep, feeling the deep, quiet joy that comes from knowing your loved ones are safe. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and soft. Inside, I felt the warmth of clarity, the light of understanding, and the peace that comes from knowing you've done what mattered most. I never opened that door. I stayed in the truck. And in doing so, I learned a truth that has carried me through every storm since. Sometimes the bravest act is to pause, to trust, to listen, and to wait. That night was not just a night of survival, it was a lesson in life, in love, and in the quiet courage that defines us when no one else is watching. The snowplow driver, Eli, my daughter, and even we are all part of that story now. A story of fear, of trust, of choices, and of the small, crucial moments that define a life. And if there's one thing I hope anyone hearing this will take with them, it's this: the world will challenge you, storms will come, fear will speak. Listen carefully, act wisely, and remember that sometimes staying put is the strongest, bravest choice you will ever make. The door stayed closed, and we lived.